This is a game called Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. This is from Hollandspiele Games. I've been trying to find a reason to get something from them for a while now, and this one caught my attention. This is a brigade-scaled game of the American Civil War. This battle occurred on the peninsula. You might say it just preceded the 7 Days Battle. Nicely, professionally produced package here. I'm going to get it out of the box. It's a fairly small box, kind of thin, but it's a fairly compact game. Now I noticed right away was I went to pull the counters out and they kind of popped right off. So they're cut pretty well, I guess I'd say. And several of them actually came off in shipment, I suppose. This is a game series. I think there's more planned. So there's a pretty brief rule book for the game series. Another one specific to this title. And then the map, and it's not a huge map, but it covers the space pretty well. I used to be a fiend for ACW games, so I do have other titles on this, other publications on this title, and they tend to have gigantic maps. So I like how this focuses. I'm hoping the gameplay focuses on this as well. So looking down close, there's the titular Fair Oaks, Seven Pines. I really like this depiction of the railroad. I mean, those are some railroad tracks right there. No abstract little cross-hatching. Looks exactly like a railroad. And the little bridge across the stream there, that's cool. Do have some nice depiction of the terrain, I think, as well as the fortifications that were in place. I'll get the counters out of the This is brigade scaled, so the units mainly represent the brigades. And we're also seeing divisions and corps here as well. And the Confederate forces. A lot of familiar names. And a great number of step counters. I understand that's how the game will track strength. So I'm going to go ahead and get the counters out and familiarize myself with the game. Just to take a quick look, I didn't know anything about the company's business model, but later I learned they are a print-on-demand shop. So when I ordered this game, I got an email from some other company saying that they, were shipping me something. I thought, what? Did I order something without knowing it again? But no, it arrived and it was this game. So the counters look pretty good. But unfortunately, there were a little bit of production problems. When I get to this side, it'd be kind of hard to tell, but Anderson, Longstreet, they're starting to get a little skewed and a little unclear. And that kind of continues down. So very, very clear, slightly distorted. It's actually kind of a 3D effect. If you look at it from A low angle looks a certain way. If you look at it from a higher angle, it looks a little different. And also continues, fortunately, on the back as well. Like meager there is a little unclear, little must. So maybe that's, a risk of the print on demand. But luckily I'm very nearsighted and I probably won't be able to tell that those things are a little fuzzy when I'm playing anyway. Okay, one other thing that I'll get on with it. I like to use a knife when I cut out my counters. No corner clipping for me, and you absolutely have no need to clip corners with this production. They have they have a really clean strike on these two sides, and then a very small nub right in the center. So it's, trim, out pops the counter. That's far preferable to the typical four-corner, trim that you have to do. So, just my opinion. So here's the game, played through, I think, the 6th turn here. This is the historical scenario. I've read through the rules, tried to practice some, dispelled all my mistaken first impressions. Now I'm on my mistaken third impressions, which is generally how I go about learning games. Do it wrong for a while until I start doing it right. Let's move in for a closer look here. Here are some units. These are of the same divisions. You can tell just by the color coordination of the background. Standard infantry symbol. That is the indicator for the division, the corps, the brigade name, so the commander of the brigade, and then the stars. The stars are a kind of a quality rating. So this brigade has 3 stars. This division is pretty high quality. They all have 3 stars. These brigades, not so much. 2 stars. There are even a couple of brigades with 1 star. Another quality rating is for red stars. That indicates an elite unit. So picket here is a quality unit and an elite unit at the same time. Those confer combat advantages. The more stars you have, the better off you are. Then there are artillery pieces. Artillery is very good at ranged fire, and of course also at close-in fire. So infantry pieces have a good order front side, and then due to combat or fire, they can have a disrupted backside. So the D indicates disrupted. Artillery has the firing side and then the unlimbered side, or excuse me, the limbered side. So that's limbered with a little L, no fire. Unlimber, got the number back, that's their fire factor, and they can fire. So we have all these units and the map. So the map, hexes are 250 to 300 yards is what the series rules indicate. The units are brigade scale. I think infantry and cavalry are brigades. There is a special unit type called sharpshooter. I don't know if they're strictly speaking brigades, but sharpshooters, there's cavalry, and of course the artillery. Not entirely sure what the scale is for the artillery. Probably more like battalions. So the strength of the brigades is a little abstracted. Obviously all these brigades weren't the exact same number of men, but they all, well, most of the infantry brigades start with, a unit counter and then the step counters. The step counters are just abstract indicators of strength. So this particular brigade is currently at 4 steps, full strength. 3 step markers, 3 generic step markers, and then the unit counter. Um, Not all brigades, usually the senior rules will call out how strong brigades are, but like this division has only 3 steps, 2-step markers in the unit counter. So they're a little weaker. But I think we would know if you were to go to an OOB of the period that all these brigades weren't identical in size. This is just sort of a proportional approach to strength. So for the most part we have full strength units here. There's been some combat here in the center. We see that this federal unit, Devon's brigade, is in a lot of trouble. He's lost all his generic strength. He's down to just his unit counter. So that means the next casualty he would take in combat would eliminate that unit. So the units have these colors, in this case, red up here, and that indicates their division. This is D.H. Hill's division. The green is Sedgwick's division. Where's Sedgwick? Where's Hill? Well, that takes us to this idea of the activation track. The activation track is the representation of command. You can, well, maybe I should talk about the time scale a little bit. The time scale is somewhat abstracted. The game turn, it is divided into turns. I think that purpose is really just to control activations. So each turn is divided into impulses. Each player has an impulse, and they can activate, depending on the game, 1 or more of their formations. In this title, if you were to activate multiple, that would show a level of coordination in your army. In this title, the most you can do is activate 1 division per impulse. So the Federals would have an impulse. They would choose to activate a division. That division, the units, the individual brigades, artillery, what have you, would then undertake actions. That could be movement and so on. And then they would conduct any combats. Then the impulse would end, and you would allow the Confederate player to have an impulse. And you switch back and forth like that, trading impulses and activations until you've activated or otherwise dispensed with all of your divisions in your commands. That constitutes a game turn, and then you advance the game turn marker on the track and keep going. So the time scale, I don't think it's fixed. It's kind of fluid, maybe continuous. 1 turn isn't, equal to 1 hour, I don't think. It doesn't seem that way. Because early in the game, in this game in particular, there are only a couple of divisions that can be activated. So each side gets an impulse. Each side activates 1 division and does something, and then the turn's over and you move on to the next one. Later in the game, like right now, the Federals now have 4 divisions. The Confederates have 2. So that turn is going to be, representing a little bit more time, since all those divisions are not going to be moving simultaneously. Or not, what do I know? But that's how I'm interpreting it. That I'm not looking at 12 hours of combat. It's more like, hey, this is 12 turns of activations. Let's just think about that, not worry about the time. So, as all these things are occurring, you're consuming your forces by using them. And it's represented by this activation track. Your division leaders don't sit on the board with their forces. They're here on the track. And when you undertake an activation, you regress them down the track. It's a good word right out of the rule book. And then the units undertake some sort of activity. And then you pass or you relinquish the impulse to the other player. And they do the same. Say we were to undertake an activity with Huger here. He would move. His forces would then move. He'd be flipped to done when he was finished with his activation, and so on. You trade back and forth. So the significance of this is that at the beginning of the game, you start with your forces. I think Kearney is actually right here. With your division leaders in some spot on this activation track. And it kind of indicates freshness, I think, of the formation. And when you undertake an activity, you're moving this way. And when you're in a colored area, you want to try to stay there as long as possible, because one of the options for your activation is to be passive. And when you're passive, you can move back to the right and regain some of that freshness. But once you pass out of a colored area into the next colored area, the most you can regain is the rightmost spot in that colored area. So once Sedgwick moves from 6 to 5, as he keeps undertaking actions in subsequent turns, the best he can do is recover to 5. He can never get back up into the green, super fresh area. So slowly, as the game progresses, you're going to have to undertake actions. You're not going to be able to take passive turns. So you'll use up your men progressing down towards this 0 spot. 0 is the place where you can no longer take an action. The only thing you can do is try to rally, get yourself back out of that, up into the track somewhere. The only thing your units can do is withdraw. They can sort of get away from the enemy, but they can't undertake normal movement or combat unless they're attacked. If they're attacked, they'll fight back. So that's how the command system works. I didn't pay attention to where Sedgwick was. Maybe he was here. You regulate the movement and activities of your army through the impulses and these activations. And the farther to the left you go, the more dangerous it is that you may end up not being able to undertake any activations and leaving your formations very, exposed and possibly more prone to disintegration if they can't defend themselves. Now, in addition to undertaking actions and sort of consuming this kind of freshness, readiness, anytime you take a loss of a unit, that also will bump you over. So when your forces start to get ground down, you need to be careful not to start losing units and knocking your division into less and less capable state. So when you have an activation, you can undertake a number of actions. You can move, and that's just standard move on the map board, spending movement points and so on. You can entrench. So these guys decided to entrench, and then you can charge. Charge is one of the combat types. There's ranged fire combat and then close-in combat, and charge is a way to initiate sort of a advantageous close-in combat attack. It does require movement. You have to be at least 1 hex away in order to initiate a charge. And infantry as well as cavalry can charge. Artillery, not so much. They can be the target of charge. So you can undertake actions, and then once you've undertaken actions for your activation, then you can conduct combat based on the actions you've taken. So in this case, during this turn, this is Hill's division. He's actually already moved. His activation is done. But he conducted a charge attack on that hex, which he ended up winning at the conclusion of the combat. But then he had these forces here that were actually in support, and this one was able to conduct a fire combat at range. It is now disrupted because he was then attacked by Sedgwick in a fire combat. That's how the game progresses. You keep trading impulses and activations until you've used up all your activations, and then advance the game turn and keep going. Combat resolution is a little different from my experience. Not that that means anything, but it's a combination of this tables and then the calculation of the strength, the differential of the attacker and defender strength. And these tables sort of sum it up. You sum up all of these numbers. Say if you're going to attack, you take the number of steps in the attacker plus the number of stars in the attacker plus supporting units, and you get the idea, plus, plus, plus. And then you, for the defender's value, you roll mostly a 1d6. Now there are some cases where you can roll 2d6. And then you add the steps of the defender, and then you take the differential of that. So the die roll is in determining the defender's defense value. Once you have that differential, you just cross-reference and apply the result. Maybe I don't have a good head for math, but I find myself always sort of losing track. What do I have? 6, 7, minus what? 3? So I've been a little slow at executing combats as I try to count on my fingers and toes the number of attacker and defender values. When it's first laid out in the rules, it makes it seem like there's this 3 crazy kinds of combat, but really it's just one mechanism and then 3 tables that you cross-reference on to figure out what the outcome is. So firing versus close combat versus sharpshooter combat, they're all kind of the same mechanism. You just resolve it on the different tables. Slightly different specific modifiers based on which of those combats, but otherwise very, very similar. Since I mentioned the rules, I think I should just look at them real quick. They're very brief. I just messed up some counters, but see how thin the book is? So they're not overwhelming. Probably an intermediate level of game. There's plenty of stuff going on. That's the unusual part. Very small set of rules, and yet lots of mechanics. Not that that's a bad thing. Just they're covered pretty effectively. And my only challenge is that some of the things are inside the rule book that I don't know very well yet. So I have to keep going in there and looking them up, like movement points. There's no terrain charge or anything like that. I, took a few times before I could figure out was I'm supposed to spend 1 or 2 movement points there. And the sequence of play is inside the rule book and not like on a player A card, so I keep stumbling over that. But it's it's coming. It's just repeated play will clear all that up. I think each of the titles will have its own sort of specific rule book as well. And this has a pretty nice write-up, some historical commentary. Actually, about half of the book is historical commentary, so that's kind of cool if you like to read that sort of stuff. But the scenarios, there's 4 of them, lay out the starting positions and some special rules for how the forces start to arrive, especially reinforcements, as well as the victory points, typical. But they're all very, very brief, to the point. I'd say the only thing that I struggled with from the rule perspective and getting started is I didn't have a good narrative in my head from reading the rules on how the game should play. Sometimes I think I'd like in lieu of some historical commentary, I'd like a narrative of a turn of gameplay. First you do this, the first player has an impulse, they activate, they do this, and within that sort of narrative structure, just put some rule indicators in there for me. That way I can go back to it and sort of see the flow of the whole game, rather than just like a lot of disparate mechanics. Even though it follows the sequence of play, the rules, it still didn't flow for me until I sort of pounded through it a few times. So at this point, I think I need to groove, the advantages and disadvantages of the activation process. I found myself the first couple of playthroughs trying to preserve the green status to the point where I wasn't doing anything. So you can't win by staying in the green. You have to commit your forces. So I think I get that much. But the next thing is the combat interactions. I keep thinking I want to stand a distance and fire, and yet I'm not having a lot of effects with that. So I'm trying to figure out how to get some sort of a combined arm thing going here. I think the close combat and the charges are really the only way to effectively disrupt and dislodge the enemy. Especially given the relative short span of the game. I mean, one activation per turn. You can get through a lot of turns pretty quickly, and if you're not careful, you will have accomplished nothing. You've inflicted no casualties, gained no ground. So I'm trying to figure that out, and I guess that's the fun of games, right? Trying to see how to best use the mechanics and the forces in that presentation. So, how does it play? It's definitely a for effect type of game. The scenario book points out that the most significant historical outcome to this battle was the wounding of Joseph Johnston, the Confederate commander, and his subsequent replacement with Robert E. Lee. So there's no Joseph Johnston represented in the game, so you can't get him killed. There's no McClellan. There's no Union Corps commanders. In effect, their jobs have already been done. McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign. Johnson mapped out this plan of attack. The Corps commanders had put their units in their dispositions. Now it's up to the low-level commanders, the divisions, to fight this out, and their command dynamic is represented in that activation tract. It's a typical kind of slugfest ACW, right? The combats are kind of bloody, but then maybe I don't have the full grasp of the dynamics of the different styles of combat yet. There's obviously a limited space to this map, so there's not going to be a huge opportunity to launch some sort of extra maneuver. Again, Johnston already made his plan. That's already been set. The forces are converging right here. Now there is a scenario. Well, I guess this historical scenario kind of puts you in the shackles as a Confederate player with the historical challenges that they had in pulling off that plan. There is another scenario that sort of releases you from that and gives you a chance to fight the plan as Johnston had intended. So that's some good experience there to play both, see how it goes. But you're still focused with the slugfest right in this area. It's not like you can decide to fight 2, 5, 10 miles away. And the focus is on the command. We have quite a number, maybe too many combat options at our disposal, but yes, we're depleting units, but we're really grinding down the will to fight and the ability to fight, as represented by that activation track. And that more or less determines the outcome of the game. Now, it is a victory point based kind of system, for this title anyway. I don't know if they'll all be that way. Pretty sure there's more in the works. And it's based on both geographical locations captured as well as the amount of, we'll say, material you throw into the fight. So as a Confederate player, you get to decide how much of your divisions you want to commit. The more you commit, the more victory points you give to the Union player, meaning you're expending a whole lot of effort to achieve, which is really going to be kind of a stalemate outcome. So casualties, commitment, and geographic control is what determines the victory. And I think basically the game achieves its ends pretty well. I mean, within the confines of what it's trying to do. I do like that activation track and the way it affects play and decisions by the player, which I think is important. I, as a player, want to make decisions based on mechanics and my forces and the conditions on the field. And I think it definitely wins in that regard. One thing I think I'd say is that at this scale, the diversity of combat options might not be that complementary. The amount of fire combat at this range probably, I mean, it shows in the fire results table that it's not that effective. So it ends up being sort of a bother. I mean, really, artillery is the only thing that's effective. And maybe the infantry fire and infantry combat should be more of the close range. But I haven't played enough to be entirely certain of my opinion on that. Maybe I'm influenced by other gaming experiences.